Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as I hope you know now, because we're in our 26th year of production, I interview writers and other kinds of artists about their craft, what they're doing now, what they've created in the past, what their plans are for the future. Sometimes we have writers of poems, we have writers of novels, short stories, we have editors sometimes. And beyond the world of writing, we have had on playwrights, or that's a writer, playwright, sculptors, painters, musicians, dancers, all sorts of artists. And it's a pretty wide net. If you have an idea for a guest who might be right for the Writer's Block, look for our address at the end of the program. We'd be very happy to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block and all the other productions that come out of Cape Ann TV is a production of cable access television. You don't get this wonderful community service with Dish. So if you see any Dish ads or you're tempted, turn away, stick with cable. This evening, we do have a writer/editor by the name of Greg Phipps, and I'm very happy to have him on the show. We have not had an editor for some time, and their job with newspapers is extremely important. Greg was born and raised in the Boston area, Quincy and Braintree, then moved for a while and graduated from high school in Sturbridge. He served in the Coast Guard and then lived for a while working on newspapers in California before moseying back east again, where he took a bachelor's degree in English at Keene State and worked for newspapers here on the East Coast, the Brattleboro Reformer and the Roxborough, North Carolina Courier-Times among them. He later became full-time employed by the Cape Ann Beacon and other papers owned by, I get this right, Gatetown Media.
Gatehouse Media.
Gatehouse Media, I blew that. Gatehouse Media, which owns the Cape Ann Beacon, the Swampscott Reporter, and online runs the Wicked Local website, which has the news reporting from those and other papers. Greg Phipps, thanks for being down here.
Thank you for having me.
I am anxious to talk to you about editing because I think editors, although you write a great deal, are often in the background and readers don't understand really what you guys do. What is an editor's job in a general sense on a newspaper?
Well, it's I think the editors for the papers that we have, at least the papers in the north section of the Wicked local newspapers here in the North Shore, basically oversee the entire newspaper to basically make sure that we put out a paper every week, that you have stories, that you have certain strings, sections, art news, business news, town news, city news, whatever area you're covering, make sure that that's all covered to the best of our ability, and really overall it should just make sure we get a newspaper out.
So you are at a smaller paper. You're now at the Swampscott Reporter.
That's right, yes.
At a smaller paper like that, you are the editor-in-chief.
Well, the editor, yes. Editor-in-chief, I think that's one step up. We have somebody who has that role as editor-in-chief of the whole branch of papers.
Oh, of many newspapers.
Yes.
But you are the editor
of the Swampscott Reporter right now.
So
yes.
do you assign stories to
Well, unfortunately, I don't have an official staff of reporters. I do use freelancers for our paper, and I do have one very loyal freelancer who works for me and others. So that's one way we get people to cover things. I cover certain events, meetings sometimes, and we try to do in-depth news on certain issues pertaining to the city or town that we cover. Yeah.
So this is not like the old movies at the Washington Post or the New York Times where you have a broad staff to...
Well, that was, for a big city paper, it's probably still that way. Certainly, I imagine the Boston Globe, even though they have had a lot of layoffs and lost a lot of
Yeah.
employees recently. The newspapers for the big dailies are pretty much probably still very much like that. And also, there are other big papers. Some of the papers that Gatehouse owns are like that. Patriot Ledger, and also I believe they now own the Providence Journal. So papers like that, they're still a lot like that because they have the editor and then they have a fairly large staff of reporters and photographers. Not as big as they used to have, but it's still certainly larger than some of the papers that up the north of Boston papers that the company owns.
I want to mention to our audience that you were the editor of the Cape Ann Beacon
I was.
For a while before you moved to Swampscott.
For about 6 months, yeah.
And so I'm going to hold up a copy of the Beacon just to remind our viewers what it looks like. It is distributed on Fridays, and it is free, amazingly. Not much is free these days. And I think am I correct that the basic layout of the front pages for the Gatehouse papers is similar?
Yes.
So you can identify that it's
Pretty
the same.
uniform.
Yeah.
They have a certain set way that they lay the paper out every week. There's the off lead on the right side, the story that runs down the right side. There's the left rail, and then there's the centerpiece, and it's a down page or a lead on the top. It just depends on what you have for stories and what you have for space. They often put an ad down at the end of the bottom of the newspaper.
Like a little banner.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So that is the basic format, though. Yes.
Tell me if you're editing the Cape Ann Beacon or the Swampscott Recorder now, and the paper's out on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
It's bundled. It's distributed. Describe your basic week in the leading up to the next paper, and the kind of pressure you must feel to make sure that you've got all that space filled and everything assigned.
Well, my experience with the paper, the editor of the Cape Ann Beacon is also the editor of the Salem Gazette, which is a very similar newspaper in terms of, not similar in terms of the area covered, but similar in terms of the way the paper is run. It's also a free paper with, the first 3 pages specifically deal with Cape Ann and Salem, whereas the rest of the paper is sort of a combination of both. But week leading up to it, you want to assign, if you have stories in mind, you want to assign stories to, in this case, would be freelancers or yourself. If you yourself might be out covering something or get in touch with officials or people who are involved in the particular issue that you're covering. And you want to plan that and have things planned out so that by the time Tuesday and Wednesday rolls around of the next week that the paper is coming out, you're pretty much ready. You know what you have that's going in the newspaper, and you can have it ready to go and laid out in time.
Do you find yourself some weeks you've got a lot of freelance help, and some weeks
Yeah,
everybody's
you don't.
on vacation?
That's right.
And,
Yes.
And you have to write half the paper.
Well, that did happen to me a couple of times, and it has happened to me in Swampscott. As I said, in Swampscott, I do have one very loyal freelancer who's I can pretty much count on every week. But that's unusual because freelancers are what they are. They're freelance and they have the freedom to say yes or no. And so yes, it did happen where you were suddenly you pretty much had to find news or you had to go out and cover things yourself.
If people some of our audience is watching who like to write and they're interested in newspapers and interested in being freelancers, how would they approach the Cape Ann Beacon or the Swampscott Recorder or any of the other Gatehouse papers?
Really, I think that what I would do would be to email the editor or call the editor of the particular paper and just tell them, I'm interested in freelancing. And show them examples of your writing.
Yeah.
If you've been published before, if you've written for a newspaper, if you worked for your college newspaper, if you're a college graduate, or if you're later in life, but you've written for other publications, or even if you haven't, if you have the ability and you have examples of your work, we would look that over and see if And in a lot of cases, unless you're just not able to write very well, we would. I know that in my case, I would give somebody a chance if I had the money in the budget to afford to pay someone.
That might be a good place for somebody to start.
I would actually recommend it as a place
For
to
local stories,
consider if somebody who is interested in freelancing. The pay is not great, but
Is it per inch?
no, it's per article. We pay per article. But it is a place to start for people who have that interest. It's a way to get published and have your byline in the newspaper in a publication. So
I remember my first byline.
Yeah.
It was a kick.
I remember it myself. Yeah.
So you could write a paper, write a story for a paper, and maybe, I don't know, get 30, 40, 50 bucks for a story, and not get rich, but you could begin a career and get some credits.
It's possible.
Because you're probably not going to step into the Globe or the...
No, I mean, certainly not right away, and that's for sure. And it's a way to you could work your way into the newspaper as a full-time reporter. I mean, certainly that's how I started. I was a correspondent for the Brattleboro paper, as you mentioned, and that was a lot of years ago now. And that's kind of what I did. I was what they would say a freelancer, but they call it a correspondent, and then they pay you by the article.
Well, if you're full-time, or you say...
If you're a correspondent part-time.
Regular, yeah. When stories come in from freelancers, how much editing do you usually have to do?
It depends. Sometimes you have to edit a lot, and sometimes there's not much editing at all involved. Just depends on how experienced the particular writer is with newspaper writing, and sometimes people who are new to it, it just takes some time, but a lot of people will catch on over time on how to arrange a story that is more conducive to newspaper stories, as opposed to writing something that is, for a magazine or, something that might grab people's attention early in the story, and then, so they can move on from there. And try to make stories concise, not, try to write things that are concise, but you're still getting all the important news in the article. Sometimes people tend to write long stories when they don't need to write long stories. So that's something it takes them time to learn. It took me time.
I love the old expression, I would have made it shorter, but I didn't have time.
Right.
Less is more.
Yeah, I think that a great example of that, for me anyway, is the USA Today papers, the way they write stories. You know, if you look at that paper, you see that most of the stories aren't more than average 15 or 20 inches, and they get a lot of them in their stories.
They don't jump either, do they?
They might, I don't know, but I think that you're right. They don't often do that because their stories are 20 inches, and they can do even a feature article of 20 inches and still make it be very interesting.
That's another free paper.
Yeah. The USA Today?
Is it free?
I don't think it's free. I think it's not very expensive. I think it's $1.
Oh, I get it when I'm traveling in hotels. I've never.
Some places do give it out free. No,
and it's always just there to pick up.
Yeah, but that's a great example of how to write concise news articles of any kind, really. For a paper like this, that's invaluable because the Beacon, and I think it's still as it was when I was editing it. It's only been 6 months since I started being editor at Swampscott. That shorter stories would be great for the Beacon because they could put more in there. In the past, one of the problems I had is we had stories that were so long that one story took up almost 2 pages. So that's an invaluable thing to have, especially if writing for a paper like the Beacon right now. So
you have freelancers on local stuff, then you pick up maybe a food article or other kinds of articles off wire services.
Yeah, we do that too.
And and this is a fairly hefty paper. I mean, I know it's a weekly, but it's a substantial paper. I'm curious about the business model. It's a free paper.
Right.
And in the Gloucester Times is I think $1 now. Mm-hmm. The Gloucester Daily Times. and I know newspapers are struggling. So how can a corporation like Gatehouse uh, bring out papers that don't cost anything?
That's a great question. There's obviously some benefit to the for it. I don't know what that benefit is myself. I mean, being that I'm was an editor, and my job anyway, was to just put the newspaper out. The business model of putting out a free paper, well, number one, they're exactly the same as the inside of the paper is exactly the same as the Salem Gazette. So there are two papers that are putting out the same midsection with arts news and that type of thing. What is unique to Cape Ann is some of what's inside, but the first 3 pages of both those papers, Cape Ann and Salem, are unique to those cities. News that is unique to those cities. The business model, I'm honest with you, I'm not really sure what exactly benefit they get from it, but obviously there is some. Their decision to do that.
Are
Yeah.
ad inches healthy?
Yeah, I think that's probably plays part of a role because they have, as I said, the first 3 pages in the Beacon is specifically geared to the Cape Ann region, news of the Cape Ann region. So obviously ad space, I'm sure, plays a role in it. That's not my expertise in the business, so I don't know exactly how all that plays out, but I'm sure that does play a role.
I think the sales space in the Cape Ann Beacon is fairly healthy.
Yes.
I don't know how the space is priced.
Right.
It's probably not real expensive, so they have to get a lot of ink out there. And they must be doing that because it's survived for up here now for a number of years.
Yeah, and I'm sure that whatever financial ad revenue or whatever revenue they're getting from the Cape Ann Beacon specifically is enough that they feel it's it's certainly worthwhile to keep putting out a paper, and a free paper, as you said. Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask you about another dual role. You put out the paper, the print paper. Are you involved also in the Wicked Local website,
Oh, yes,
which
yeah.
has the Beacon and Swampscott and other sites?
Yes.
So you edit both, essentially.
Well, yeah. I mean, the editing is for the stories that go both in the print edition and online. We typically put most everything we put in print, we try to put online. Sometimes that doesn't happen for various reasons, but most of the time, everything that we publish, all the printed material, stories, press releases, strings, calendars, all that stuff, gets put online, as well as being put in
feed that
print.
to the webmaster? Kind of
Actually, there's a
automatically?
way to post it online. We have a procedure that we go through to post the items online, whether it's a story, whether it's a photograph, photo gallery, a video. There's ways that we post this stuff
So it's
online.
pretty seamless.
Yeah, it's
I
not
was
really.
picturing a wall and a window, and then the IT guys are on the other
Yeah.
side. And
No, it's actually it's pretty. It's not really that. It's a pretty simple procedure once you understand how to do it. And we have a system that we have. We format our stories, and then we just there's a way that from that system that we can post the stories online to our websites. And also, and then we have the way that we send the stories over to what we call Design House, which is in Austin, Texas now. Design our newspapers, yeah, and they put the story. They put the stories on the pages, and ends up being
so
which turns out to be the newspapers, yeah.
So the Swampscott Reporter and the Cape Ann Beacon are designed in Austin, Texas.
That's correct.
Laid out.
Yes. Yes.
No cut and paste anymore.
No, those at least for the papers here are gone. Those days, I don't think there are too many papers doing that anymore.
No, I don't imagine.
There probably are some, but not many.
But it's that non-local.
Yes.
The Wicked Local newspapers are laid out
Yeah.
in Austin, Texas. I love it.
Well, they are still printed in Framingham, Mass. So the actual print, the actual printing takes place in Framingham, I believe. Anyway, don't Don't, set me in stone on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case.
That last question I had, remark about being published or laid out in Austin, has to do with my next question, I think. Newspapers have changed unbelievably in my lifetime. When I was a kid growing up in Chicago, I think there were 3 or 4 morning papers, 3 or 4 evening papers, and all gone. I think when I moved from Chicago, there was 1 or 2 morning papers, 1 or 2 evening papers, and they don't have that anymore. Same thing happened in Boston.
Yes.
Where is our newspapers, the actual papers, going to be in 10 years?
Well, I
Or
choose to be
15?
optimistic. I have gone through periods of time where I thought that maybe the printed newspapers were going to go the way of the dinosaur, but I don't believe that anymore. I think they'll survive. I really do. In what type of format, I'm not sure, but I believe that 10 years from now they'll still be around.
Yeah.
Certainly there'll be. Certainly there'll be some changes, technology and what we're able to do now with the internet. There'll be new ways of putting out news will be there, but I don't think the newspapers will go away. I really don't. I think they'll still be around. That's just my feeling.
Gatehouse is huge, is it not?
It is very big,
It's
yes.
national.
Yes.
And so they're probably not going to go anywhere.
No, and I think that I believe that they support the idea of printed newspapers, and I feel like I just have a feeling that there's still a lot of people out there that like to pick up a newspaper and read it. I know I do, and I think there are young people do. I see young people with newspapers all the time. So my feeling is that the newspapers will survive because I just feel that people still like to have something in their hand
Yeah, I still
to
love it.
read. And they still like having physically, a newspaper physically there to hold on to and not just go on the internet and look at the news that way.
Some years ago, I introduced at a college where I was teaching newspaper machines, vending machines, because I wanted the students to read more. And the papers pulled them out in about 3 months because they couldn't move the papers. This is before cell phones too. So I still try to get them to read papers, either online or in paper form. But it's been sort of an uphill battle,
Yeah.
increasingly so.
Well, there's no doubt that the internet, computers, and reading things now on a screen. Now people have, what do they call them? Anyway, the pads, yeah, where you can actually read books that way now, and so a lot has changed, and that will affect newspapers and printed books as well. But I still, there's just something in me that still believes that. It's not going to go. They'll still be around. I say in 10 years, and hopefully for a long time.
I certainly hope so too. I noticed the New York Times has pages now of the New York Times store, and they sell everything from maps to sports souvenirs, and sometimes a paper will have 4 or 5 or 6 pages of store material in different sections. The split page for different sections will be their store, and I sometimes wonder if they're not going to look like a Sears catalog in 10 years.
Well, that is one concern that I do have, that the papers will be too much of that down the road. That they will still be papers, but 60-70% of the paper will be what you just talked about, and 30% will be news. Will be news articles, and hopefully that won't happen. But I can see that being a potential result of the increase of the internet and
They sell good stuff.
websites and the whole thing. But I tell you, there's still a lot of good newspapers out there, national newspapers, I believe. I think USA Today is a good paper. I do, like a lot of people feel like the Wall Street Journal is probably one of the best newspapers in the world. And the New York Times is very good, and the Globe, and the Herald. So there are a lot of good papers out there still, and with a lot of news and sports and arts content in them.
Yeah.
So hopefully, I just feel like myself that newspapers will survive for a while anyway.
I like the optimism. I hope so, too.
Well, I guess it's because
I-
I'm a newspaper
You're a
person.
newspaper
I want to
person,
want to feel that way. But I do understand people's concerns because of the tremendous, well, over the last 25 years, with the sudden appearance of the internet and the tremendous
yeah,
growth,
yeah.
you know, and technology, and now people have all these other devices that they can read news off of.
Constantly, yeah.
Yeah, and it's constant now. You're right. But
I just got the 2-minute signal from
Oh,
cameraman Jim Capillo, and I've got to begin to close. Greg Phipps, I want to thank you very much for coming down
You're welcome.
tonight to be on the show. I appreciate it. We haven't had an editor on in a long time, and I like to get into the background of what goes on with newspapers. So thank you very much.
okay, thank you, John.
I want to thank you in TV cable land as well for being with us. If you've learned something from Greg Phipps about the editorial life, what it means to be an editor, the future or the possible future, an optimistic future for newspapers, then the Writer's Block has done its job. I hope we can do that job for you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.